We will have another break, so there will be another break before we have the keynote speaker, and so there will be another time to check in with the tables. If you're hungry again, there will still be pizza and some fruits and veggies, and so feel free to take that break then. But for now, we are going to get started with our lived experience panel. Um, Super appreciate everyone who's been here today, especially appreciate our current panelists. It does take a lot of courage to come up and speak about your lived experience with mental health issues and symptoms. And it's something that at the same time can be really beneficial for others to hear and to help with advocacy. So um, we'll do introductions here, and then after introductions, if we could please make sure to give these folks a round of applause. That'll be great. So to start things off, if we could do a brief introduction about who you are and what you do.
Testing 1 2. It appears to work. That's good. My name is James Falk. Longtime local resident. Went to junior high and high school in Humboldt County at Eureka High, and went to Cal Poly Humboldt, which was at HSU at the time. Graduated, and have worked in the community ever since. I was and am a journalist in Humboldt County. I wrote for the local paper for 10 years and ended up as city editor. At some point during that span of time, I was playing softball, and some meathead playing first base planted his foot right in the center of the bag. I was running to first base, tripped over his foot, and snapped my leg. Tibial plateau fracture, which is basically like breaking off the shoulder of your lower leg bone. Had steel pins put in my leg and got introduced to narcotics. It didn't take me long. I discovered that for whatever reason, my particular brain liked the feeling of opiates, and it made me feel less anxiety than I've ever felt. And I'd long been plagued by anxiety because my situation with trauma from my earlier life. So I ended up going from pills to, or from Norcos to heavier pills, ultimately ended up on heroin, while still the editor of the Time Standard. And then at one point, I realized that it was out of my control. I couldn't stop using, and my life was going to fall apart. So I left the Time Standard, went into treatment, and I was in treatment for about 45 days, not long enough, and got out, came back to Eureka, started using again, and then I got arrested. My picture was on the paper or the cover of every newspaper in town, the lead of every news program. James Falk, former Time Standard editor, arrested for possession of heroin. And that's where stigma grabbed hold of me, and I basically plummeted. My life fell apart, and it took me a long time to battle back. So that's my particular concern and experience with stigma, and I'll have more to say as we go. It took me a long time to get clean, and then ultimately I found another job as a journalist. Luckily, at Keat TV, they decided to give me a chance. I helped produce or came up with the idea for Addicts Among Us, a documentary locally about addiction. Lauren Montagna directed it. She did a fantastic job. So I'd like to, on my show that I do for Keat, talk a lot about these issues and keep the conversation going because I think it's important.
Hi, my name is Wes Harrison. Most of you know me as the executive director of Crossroads. I've been doing that for about 11 years. But before that, what brings me to the lived experience panel is my long-standing history and experience with substance use disorder and mental illness. I am the child of a severe schizophrenic mother. She was my sole provider, and she raised me in the city of Crescent City. So I was raised from a very young age by a schizophrenic woman in a county and city that probably has some of the worst services, historically speaking, for mental health. From a very young age, my entire perception was shaped through the lens of what my schizophrenic mother experiences and the lifestyles and substance use that I was exposed to through being raised by her. I have seen extreme ups and downs with her. I have seen periods of times where she was able to maintain success and periods of times where she wasn't able to maintain success. And I have seen ultimately what happens when the system fails. She passed away when I was 21 years old. And I have always been pretty sour about that. In my experience, I would relate most of my mental health and substance use to core issues experienced in my childhood. My complex post-traumatic stress disorder, along with my substance use disorder coming from generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, all feel deeply rooted in some of the chaotic experiences that I experienced as a childhood. I loved my mother deeply and know her to be a very caring and wonderful soul. I also know that without adequate and proper supports, what she experienced, and by proxy, what I experienced in my life. And I hope through these conversations and panels like these today that we can help evolve public perception in order to change the way we treat individuals and communities suffering from these ailments. Because I do believe success is obtainable and maintainable.
Thank you, Wes. So I'm Leah Nagy. First of all, I want to thank you guys for being here. I kind of think we're preaching to the choir. I think you guys have a vested interest in our community and mental health, mental illness, and substance abuse. But I'm Leah Nagy, and I'm president of NAMI Humboldt, and I I was first introduced to mental illness as a special education teacher in Redwood, California. And that was the era where they used to think kids didn't have bipolar disorder. And I have a little kid that would come to school and want to kill himself in the morning and then be happy in the afternoon. And I could see these kids weren't intentionally misbehaving. They had some mental health issues. Then Newsweek published that magazine, and on the front it's called The Bipolar Child. That was a really a breaking article. In fact, it actually helped one of my grandsons get diagnosed with bipolar disorder as a young child. But anyway, so I started driving kids after I got off teaching up to Dr. Annaline at Children's Services. The parents didn't have the money or the cars sometimes to transport these kids. So I kind of got introduced to mental illness through my students. But then 25 years ago, and I can remember it to this day, I got a call that my own son was having an issue. He happened to have a best friend named Eli, and Eli is now supervising the CSU unit. At that time, he was a mental health aide on Sempervirence. And what better person to have in your life for your son's best friend that somebody that knew about mental illness, knew how to coach me to get a 5150 welfare check, and knew how to guide me as a family member through this process. I'm going to tell you guys, I had a master's degree from Humboldt State, now Cal Poly. I did not know where Sempervirence was. I did not care to know where it was. I wanted nothing to do with mental illness. I had heard my mother's mother was mentally ill with manic depressive illness in the Midwest. I remember meeting her as a 5-year-old and thinking how much fun she was. But I do remember odd things like pictures ripped out of a magazine with big nails on the walls. To me, that was a little unusual. And she made these slippers with cardboard and yarn, and she must have made like 20 pairs of these odd shoes. Anyway, but when I found myself drafted, and I call it drafted into the mental health illness arena overnight practically, it changed my whole life. It changed my trajectory, and it's one of the reasons why I am here. I want to help other family members get through this trauma that we face. And, 1 in 4 folks have a diagnosed mental illness. I bet all of us in this room have someone in our family that has had a mental health challenge. So thanks for being here. I'm going to pass it to my wonderful son, Joe.
Oh, hi guys. My name's Joe. Joe Nagy. I had a normal upbringing, I say. And was diagnosed when I was about 25. And so I got to hear about stigma sometime along the line. And got to see some of that play out. But I just wanted to come be a part of this and maybe pass some things along. And I've been battling mental illness for about 26 years or so. And I'm happy to be alive and well.
Thank you all for being here. We'll jump into the first question. Can you tell us about a time where you experienced stigma related to mental health and or substance use related?
Yeah, I tend to think that stigma is responsible to a large degree for my illness in the first place. Which is interesting, like Wes, was raised with a schizophrenic parent. He wasn't my sole caregiver, so I did have that going for me. My mom was healthy and worked outside the home, but that meant that my dad was home with me a lot of the time. So there was trauma there, and there were a lot of episodes. But what I remember most is that we couldn't talk about his illness. It was always dad's nerves are acting up, was basically like the sort of cover language that we used. And it took me a long time to actually figure out that my dad had what you would call a mental illness. And by the time I figured that out, I was deeply ashamed of it because he didn't work. He wasn't like other kids' dads. He would fly off the handle, occasionally get sort of violent towards my mother, especially, and sometimes toward us kids. And I basically, in my early teenage years, I loathed everything that had to do with him because of all of that kind of together. It really taught me to internalize my own weakness and to never want to express to folks if I was going through something, because I was really deathly afraid that I myself was going to end up schizophrenic. And that lasted until I was like 17 to 20, when I realized that if I was going to have schizophrenia, it would probably have manifested or would be actively manifesting at that time. It didn't happen, luckily, and it hasn't happened to any of my kids, so that's good. But it taught me not to want to share things that were going on internally, and to kind of try and bottle it up and keep it down. And as a consequence of, I think, of having all that shame, it bred a incessant level of sort of niggling anxiety that really dominated my life, especially as I became a journalist. I would write the story at work and it would be great, and I'd come home and then I'd spend the whole night up worried about what my sources or the public was going to say about a story. But my ego was deeply attached to the job, so I couldn't let it go. So it was just kind of this cycle that kept perpetuating. And then I suddenly discovered that if I took a certain pill or drug, then all of a sudden all that went away and I was a Superman. So stigma, I think, helped lead me into my illness and then kept me from getting treatment later on. Obviously, for a particular episode, having my arrest, being a public figure and then being arrested and having all that be out was hard for me because, as I said, my ego was so invested in my job that afterwards, whenever I would go out in public, people would exchange looks and be like, there's the guy, he's the guy that was the editor who got hooked on drugs. And it took me a long time to get to where it's almost, I wouldn't say I'm proud of my addiction, but I'm content with it to be a part of my life story, because I wouldn't be who I am today without it. And I'm a much better, healthier person having gone through it. So now my superpower was my addiction in a way. And I feel like, you can't help but go through that without confronting yourself, and in that sort of battle of trying to deal with your ego and all of those things that led up to your disease, you evolve a little bit. And I think that was important.
It's hard to pinpoint a singular event in which I experienced stigma. I would say that my entire childhood was surrounded and shaped by stigma. My mother was often seen as unstable, dangerous, and a burden. Thus, her child was also seen as a burden. My mother isolated very quickly from systems of care because she feared me being taken away due to her episodes. Her protective instinct as a mother was to get a cabin and live in Crescent City away from society and only go into town once a month, which meant it was just me and her for most of the time until I was school age. And then during school, I was very unsocialized, and people had questions, and I knew better than to answer those questions. The very stigma that I was raised on taught me to be protective of the of what I was experiencing. For a long period of time, that is how I viewed the rest of society, as a threat and danger to my family unit. And that's how my mother viewed it. So we isolated for a very long time. And any time family would step in to try to help, assist, or take us in, that support was very quickly taken away because my mother's symptoms became too problematic for that family member to take on. Eventually, my aunts did step in and provide some short-term care for myself, in which I was passed around between aunties and grandparents, all the while being very, very aware of how they viewed my mother and her symptoms. So she was consistently viewed, again, as I said, dangerous, crazy, insane, not fit to be a mom. And this was the mother whom I loved and was my care sole provider. So I viewed them as being very negative people. And it shaped the way I looked at society as a whole. And throughout this process, by the time I had moved away and moved to Humboldt County, by the time I was 18, I was already a full-blown methamphetamine addict, alcoholic, addicted thoroughly to marijuana. I had already shotten up my first drug. I did that with my mom. And I watched her addiction slowly take her, even though I feel like I got away. I didn't get away from the addictive substances. I then leaned heavily into the same societal patterns that my mother had entrenched in me, which was isolate from society. I found a girlfriend who was also an addict, and we stayed together, and she also had some of those patterns, who was very prone to isolating from society. So together, we hid from society. We then got pregnant. We then had children. We then very carefully hid from society as much as we could, almost dooming my children to repeat the same cycles of childhood trauma that I endured. By many graces and many community supports, people had stepped in and wrapped themselves around my family at just the right time for me and my wife to get our stuff together and raise 4 beautiful, happy, healthy, stable children who have no idea of the level of trauma that I almost put them through and what I have been through. I would say that stigma was experienced all along the way, because I felt safer in a motel room with 4 children on the end of town than I did walking into our community and experiencing just one set of gaze from anyone. If you would even perceive my family, it felt like a threat, and it was terrifying. It felt like we were under attack, and it felt almost like everything I love would be ripped away if anyone would even find out. And that is what I hope to break down in society and in people, so that way that fear doesn't exist with anyone who needs help and is seeking help.
Wow, a couple of powerful stories to follow. I didn't think much about stigma or discrimination or mental illness until, like I mentioned before, it happened to me. And they often say if you have a best friend or someone close to you that develops a mental health problem, that is one of the most powerful ways to break down stigma and discrimination when you think about it. I taught school at Redway, and 3 of the other teachers I found out later had bipolar disorder because I started talking about my own experiences. Stigma, you become heightened aware of stigma once you have either a best friend or a child that's been diagnosed with mental illness. So terms like, which the director of the Child Development Lab at CR said to me, "Oh, I think I'm going to go to the loony bin. I need to be in sempervirens." "Oh, let's get the straight jacket. Just these common things. I know Portland had a donut shop, and they had a bipolar donut. There was a restaurant in Old Town that had, I think, a bipolar pancake or something. You start to realize that you're just heightened awareness of the stigma. So I I didn't realize that there's stigma and discrimination even in the mental health world where people are serving clients. So I did end up working 5 years for as a CCT case manager. We went out in the community and helped clients. And I was up on Semper Virens doing recovery groups for 5 years. I had a good time up there. But this is just one little example. They would refer to a cage car. Well, what is a cage car? Well, they gave the name of a vehicle that had the grid between the back seat and the front seat, and they would call it a cage car. And like Kelly Johnson said, I didn't immediately react, oh my God, that's terrible. That's like you're treating somebody like an animal, whatever. No, I said, oh, you mean the safety car? And every time I heard it, I would say the safety car. Every time I, would see it. So I think for me, the stigma and the discrimination just became way more heightened when I had someone I loved that had a mental illness. And if you're aware, NAMI California, NAMI National has a website called Stigma Busters. And if you see an ad, there was an ad on TV with a car dealer and a nurse with a hypodermic chasing somebody that was having issues. They got that ad off the network. There was a Valentine's teddy bear in a straitjacket. I'm crazy about you. This kind of stuff. And so, if you report it to NAMI Stigma Busters, they'll go after that company and take it off. So that's my role, I think, as a family member, is to keep fighting this stigma and discrimination everywhere. In the grocery store, if I hear somebody say something derogatory to maybe somebody having an issue, I might say, oh, wow, yeah, he's having a hard time. You just need to remind people that they need to respect and not use these derogatory terms involving our loved ones. Thank you.
Wow, that's a big question. I can't really think of well, I can think of a single time, but I'll just kind of generalize that undergoing these states, when you're just completely in a delusional state, you do all kinds of things. I mean, I was yelling, screaming, singing. I mean, so many different things that you do in public. You're fearless. You're just completely fearless. And it's really interesting to me to see how people react afterward when you come to your right states and you see them on the street. And you might even wave at them. You might say hello, or you might not. But to see what people choose to do then, to see what if they say hello to you, or there's generally always a reserve there that wasn't there before. I mean, I can't blame them for that. But it's really interesting to see how these things are. But yeah, and I definitely got generalized. I got kicked out of a lot of businesses, grocery stores, because of how I was acting. And I don't think I'll ever go back. Big chains. I mean, one's like, let's say names, but anyway, so yeah, there's been a lot of times that I've dealt with stigma. And anyways.
Thank you. In your observation, how has the effects of stigma changed over time? If you've as time has progressed, have you seen how stigma is kind of communicated, or what the effects are?
Societally, you mean? Or
Societally, yeah.
yeah, like over time, has it lessened, basically? It's an interesting question. I feel like stigma has lessened, but then I have surrounded by myself with people who are more open-minded about that sort of thing. I know a lot of people who, aren't involved in these circles, or, live their lives completely disconnected from, the social welfare kind of community, who it will always be until they learn better that it's pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of situation, or you're mentally weak, or, whatever the usual judgments are in terms of addiction. And if you're mentally ill, you're just broken, basically, is kind of the thinking that goes on. And I don't know that I can say overall society has improved in that regard. I think that public education efforts have helped. I think that long term, the more conversations people have, the more people who are public about the problems that they have and communicate that. Because really, it's knowing someone who is a good person who goes through it, whether it's a family member or a friend or someone that you see maybe even in media or whatever, and they have a life, and then they have a break, and then their life continues, and you can suddenly see the whole picture from a different perspective because that person was quality and will always be, and so it's not a matter of what their character is. But I think it's a slow process, and I don't know that I could. I would say it's gotten better, but marginally so with people who aren't plugged into these kinds of circles, I guess.
The question is, has stigma changed? And I would clearly say, yes, it has changed. It's evolved. That's what it's done. It has not gone away. It has not decreased. It simply became more pervasive. And I think it's also become a little more frustrating, because if you would have asked about stigma in the 70s or in the 30s, we could blame lack of education or knowledge on why stigma exists. I can't find a single reason to justify stigma or discrimination for mental health or substance use disorder other than just pure prejudice and a certain level of hate and lack of understanding that exists. So when you ask me if stigma has changed, I say it's gotten stronger and smarter, and it has rooted itself deeper. And if you look societally, you can see it. You don't have to go any further than a Lost Coast or Time Standard comment section to see just how deeply entrenched, loud, and outspoken it is. And it doesn't matter the amount of counter education you provide; you aren't changing any minds in that sense. So it's kind of like you're fighting a battle that you can't win. It almost feels willful at times. So when asked again, if I say has stigma changed, I say it's simply gotten smarter and stronger.
Yeah. Yeah, you want to clap for Wes? So I've been in Humboldt County 45 years, and I'll never forget this. My son he was 14 months into his serious bipolar disorder, and I'm just going to tell you a quick story about how stigma can change. Anyway, Sarah Arthurs was a reporter for the Time Standard, and she wanted to do a series on mental illness. Now, this was 25 years ago. This was amazing that somebody really wanted to, talk about it. And I remember Sarah came to our house and interviewed us, and she said to Joe, "Hey, Joe, you don't need to put your picture in the paper." And Joe said, "Oh, that's fine." So she took a picture of the three of us. Well, the paper came out the next day, and the picture was above the fold. You know how huge it is to get above the fold in the newspaper on the front page. And Joe said, "Oh, that's okay, Mom. Now everybody in Arcata knows why I was acting so weird." Because we had lived there. He was 5 years old when he moved to Arcata. So, that to me was just the beginning of breaking a stigma about mental illness, because the community knew our family. They knew our 4 sons. They knew us. So now they knew somebody that was amazing musicians. I don't mind if I brag on this kid. He plays steel pan, drums, congas, whatever. Anyway, so I think too for families, in the old days, Freud had the refrigerator mom that caught autism, and they used to blame parents. Any way your kid turned out, it was the parents' fault. And fortunately, over time, that part of the stigma has somewhat changed. Although you will still have parents say in my support group, "Oh, I wish I'd done something different," blah, blah, blah. I said, mental illness is a biological chemical brain disorder. It's a throw of the dice. I have 4 sons. I was married to my husband for 57 years. There was nothing unusual about one of the kids other than he had gotten the predisposition for the illness and it affected him. So I think as far as for families, it's starting to change, but we have a long way to go. And just when we get a step forward, we get a step backward. Like the politicians stating that people with mental illness are criminals and violent criminals. This kind of stuff defeats what we're trying to do. On the other hand, when you have people come out, I call it, Kelly mentioned it, if we have people come out of the closet, that's huge. Famous football players, movie stars, other people, Carrie Fisher, I got bipolar disorder. That really helps people realize, hey, and as Kelly said, in all cultures all over the world, there's mental health issues. So it's a fight. I agree with Wes. It's a common fight. And just one little other thing, we can talk about stigma and discrimination. We need to do something about it. We need to do this kind of stuff. We need to stand up when there's things happening in our community that isn't right. And I want to move beyond just the discussion to action. Thanks. There you go.
I really didn't have too much to add to that. I mean, I think we covered a lot of I think the prevalence of everybody getting diagnosed, not everybody, but so many people getting diagnosed has helped people become aware through education to help reduce stigma a little bit. But unfortunately, I think in a lot of ways it hasn't changed and it's still around. So that's really all I have to say.
Leah's answer certainly kind of led into this, but I think we can definitely dive into it more. Next question is, what has helped reduce the impact of stigma in your observation or experience?
Yeah, I mean, to sort of parse that question a little bit, what has helped reduce the impact of stigma on people who are, I found, so when I first went into treatment, I first flirted with 12-step programs and went into a meeting. And holy crap, like, to have a room full of people who were really talking real life, and talking about things that mattered. And it was revelatory for me. And even though it took me a while to get clean, just being in a place where we could talk about the things that we were struggling with and be accepted and have the whole group sort of hold your story and hold your suffering, gave me strength and hope that, propelled me, I think, into recovery later on. So I think dialogue, having conversations, people who have gone through these things need to, I understand it's difficult and it's hard, and I didn't even have the choice, so it's easy for me to say, but people need to get public. You've got to be able to say, yes, I am this person now, and but I had a past, and this thing happened to me, and I got over it, or I got through it, and so can any of you, and it's not something to be ashamed of. If people aren't afraid to say, yeah, I had shingles, 2 years ago, and it hurt like hell, then why can't we say I had an anxiety attack that left me, out of work for 3 months, or depression, or an addiction, any of those things. It's a biological manifestation of ill health. It's not a character defect, but we have to act like that, which is to say, it doesn't reflect poorly on my character to come forward and say, I had an episode. And until, society as a whole can accept that and everyone step forward who has these issues, only then will everyone realize, I think, how pervasive it is, and therefore, hopefully, lessen judgment as a result.
When asked what reduces stigma, I think the answer is pretty simple. The answer is you do. If you weren't here today in events like this would just be four people talking to an empty room. It is your compassionate eyes and open ears that help us feel safe enough to share our experiences. And when we feel safe enough to share our experiences and you hear those experiences, you relate to those experiences, you take that same compassion, empathy, and understanding into all circles in your life. Just as stigma spreads like a virus, so does empathy. So I encourage you to infect as many people as you possibly can in this world of social distancing. It is one thing that is okay to spread is love and empathy, my friends.
Yeah, so I mentioned before, reducing stigma helps when people in different professions and walks of life come out of the closet and talk about it. I think reducing stigma is what you can do here or anywhere in your community or with your friends. When you have someone, again, say something derogatory about somebody with mental illness, try and rephrase it for them. Oh, that person's having a hard time. But I think each one of us has a role in our families, in our culture, in our communities to advocate for tolerance, to advocate, as Stacy said, as for mercy, forgiveness, realize that people do recover. And just because they were ill and psychotic a few years ago, they have a future. And supporting in any way you can, whether it's donating to NAMI Humboldt or whether it's, taking bottles of water to people that are home, anything you can do. And people see you do that. People will notice, oh, wow, that's cool. And that's, I think, just by example, you can reduce stigma in our culture. Thanks.
To help reduce stigma, well, events like this, sharing our stories. We got the May's Mental Health Walk coming up, and the barbecue, and community connections like this help. Yeah, sharing our stories.
All right. What is the number one mental health myth you would like to bust today?
I think, my life experiences around addiction. So I would say that, substance use disorder, the idea that it's a character defect or a lack of willpower that keeps people from getting clean or overcoming their substance use issues. I know that almost everyone I dealt with when I was in active addiction wanted more than anything else in the world to get off the drugs they were on. They just couldn't. They would go to bed at night having decided that was the last time they were ever going to use, and then they wake up in the next morning and they'd be, clammy and ridden with anxiety, and they would have no choice. They'd have a compulsion to go use again, and without some kind of psychic break, and I don't mean that, basically some sort of powerful realization and transformative event, a lot of people can't break out of the cycle. And so we need to help support people to have those kinds of epiphanies and not judge them because they haven't had them yet. It's not something that is made to order. Each person has to come to it differently. And so it's not a matter of character. The problem is that when that kind of stigma leads people to shame, and then if they can't get out of the cycle, like my The wife's uncle committed suicide because his family judged him in a way that they basically decided he was just a weak person who couldn't stay off drugs, and he internalized that and ultimately took his own life. That's the kind of thing that happens to people because society has defined them wrongly, and I would like to see that myth go the way of the dodo bird.
I think I'm going to choose myth number 3, which is recovery from mental illness is impossible. I think we often look at treating mental health and substance use as climbing Mount Everest. We're standing at the base of the mountain, and all we see is the peak, and arriving at the peak feels impossible. Well, I'm here to tell you, friends, that recovery from mental health is not the peak of Mount Everest. It's every stone along the way. And if we all just came together and carried one stone at a time, we could move that entire mountain anywhere we wanted to. We often, as a society, look at treating mental health as being far too complex and far too large to ever adequately treat it universally. And I'm here to say that that is a cop-out. It is easy to say that the problem is too big, too large, too complex to treat. So therefore, most of us should give up and just let the professionals deal with it. What I'm here to tell you is in all my years of working with mental health and substance use disorder and growing up with it and living in it, I will tell you that there has been one key factor in between every case I've ever seen that has maintained success and every case that has tragically failed. And that is a robust, vast, diverse support system. People often support their loved ones who have mental health and quickly find that without adequate support, they burn out and feel helpless. Therefore, that support system starts to falter. They begin to feel isolated and they lack help, and often the system falls apart. On the other side of it, the care providers that are charged with being the sole provider of a caseload of 400 people, and they're responsible for managing the medication, treatment orders for individuals with mental health, they begin to feel overly burdened and unsupported. And yet the funny thing is we only look to these two individuals as the supports. When I look at it and I look at the number, and National Institute for Mental Health states that there are 3.2 million people diagnosed with schizophrenia right now, give or take. That doesn't count the undiagnosed, but let's just go with the diagnosed number. That means roughly 1.2% of the American population has schizophrenia, which means 1 in 100. You mean to tell me that 99 of us can't support the 100? Why is it just mom's fault or dad's fault or the doctor's fault when we are a large community responsible for caring for each other? Again, I will say that recovery from mental health is not the peak of the mountain, but every stone along the way.
I'd like to attack all the myths, but I'm only going to pick one for lack of time. But anyway, I think the myth that I have heard and continue to hear is that if somebody's mentally ill, it's their moral ineptitude. It's their fault. Oh, they can just get up and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get a job. What's wrong with you? You're lazy, whatever. And oftentimes that attitude differs in a family. So in my case, when my youngest son was diagnosed, my husband had the opinion that, oh, he's just lazy. He talk in Hungarian. He said, he no good. He not going to do his work, whatever. And I started with NAMI 25 years ago. We met once a month. And I started learning about mental illness, whatever. So I came on board much quicker, realizing it was a chemical biological brain disorder. It's not something somebody can control. And you will hear people in our community say, "Oh, the homeless, they just want to be homeless. They don't want to get help. They don't, they like it. They don't, it's their fault. They can get a job. Anybody can get a job." So that whole attitude that it's a moral defect, that there's something wrong if you develop mental health issues. And then a lot of parents and families feel it's something they did wrong to cause the mental illness, which, is not the fact either. And then on the opposite side, that mental illness is a defect in character. I just want to talk about the opposite idea. Kay Redfield Jamison, who is a psychiatrist with bipolar disorder, she wrote the book An Unquiet Mind. If you haven't read it, it's an amazing read. But she wrote a book called Touched by Fire. And in this book, she talks about her theory that bipolar disorder is linked to the creative gene. So Van Gogh, Edgar Allan Poe, Abraham Lincoln, Schubert, a lot of famous people in history had mental illness. And when you read that book, it's like, oh, no wonder my kid is such a wonderful musician. Oh, it's no wonder so-and-so's kid is a great artist. So that's kind of an upswing side of the downswing side where it's a moral ineptitude. Kay Redfield Jamison thinks it's actually a gift. So with that, I'll pass it to Joe.
My myth, the myth I'd like to focus on was mentioned earlier. That's infuriating to me at times, is that people with mental illness are violent. And it takes me back to a few years ago. I was at a health club and I heard these guys talking together. And this guy said, "Yeah, it's old bipolar boy out there beating up the homeless." And I'm just like, oh my God. And just that kind of language, and it just turns your gut when you hear it. And anyways, it just really doesn't sit well with me. And it makes me worry, it's personally, like when I'm around people and their kids or whatnot, people who've seen me in high states, what are they going to think, Are they going to let their guard down or not? And I've had good luck and bad luck with that. But anyways, that's the one. I don't have percentages or whatnot, but I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because it does happen. But overall, I think that's a really ugly myth.
All right, last question. How can the community get better at ending stigma in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, I think I kind of touched on that a little bit before. I think, I think people just need to get real with each other. I think that having real conversations about what life is really like and what suffering really is for each one of us every day. I think talking about those sorts of things and, getting away from the, Facebook status, everything is great. Look at my front yard, look at my new car. Like those sorts of surface level transactions build an image in people's minds of how perfect other people's lives are. Nobody's life is perfect. Everyone goes through terrible times. And if we can talk about that, then we understand that. And when we go through difficult times, we don't feel like the universe has singled us out. We're just another part of the universal experience. And so dialogue, openness, I think we all, on every level, need to stop judging other people because we don't know, what put them in that position and how they got there and what they need to get out of it. And the only way to figure those things out is to have deep and prolonged conversations that are longer than 140 characters on the internet.
What can we do? What can the community do to get better at fighting stigma in our day-to-day lives? Oh, man, I think I'm just going to come out and say it. We need to vote better. Oh, we need to vote better, folks. And I mean, I'm telling you, I mean, I'm not just talking top of the ticket. I'm talking all the way down ballot, because the people that are responsible for cutting the checks to the programs that we care about, that are out there doing the education that is actually combating the stigma and providing the services to help keep our mental health and substance use population going. Those people that are cutting those checks are the people that are getting voted into office. And when they make a decision on a service to cut, they got elected, which means people voted them in. Which means we are either not doing a good enough job of researching who these people are before we cast a ballot, or we're not being vocal enough about who they are across the level. I can't tell you how frustrating it is to watch a program get implemented because some crazy new amazing funding came through, to watch wonderful professionals who have worked their whole lives to get their degrees and their training come in and get their dream job at a facility they love, and they get to start working with a population that they're passionate about, and every day they clock in, they do their job, they make a difference, and at the end of the fiscal year, they're all very abruptly fired because the whole program and whole project is canned because a federal funding was thrown out the window or a grant was not continued. And I can't tell you how incredibly dangerous and irresponsible it is that we as a society pin these services on temporary dollars. The simple fact of the matter is, all of these things we've talked about today are a public health issue. They are health related. They should not hinge upon people's eligibility to pay for treatment. We should not be looking at income levels to be able to afford these things. We should be making sure that our governments hear us loudly and clearly, that universal health care is put on the ballot so that way everybody can afford the services and programs can be funded into perpetuity for these services to be radically available. And I'm talking radically. I'm not talking about a program opening up that has a wait list 90 days long. I'm talking about anytime you need it, it's there and in abundance. There are so many things we fund so quickly. I can't tell you how many times we will pay for road money, but we argue and bicker with each other about mental health care. To me, it seems like we have our priorities messed up. And I'm certain the crowd that probably needs to hear this isn't even here, but I'm gonna say it again. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to vote better.
Well said, Wes. So if you have relatives in different states, you might want to work with them. I think California's okay. But anyway, so what the community can do right here, which really, I think, really feeds out into other areas, is first of all, check out the NAMI.org website. And on that website, there are flyers. There's a table with flyers. But we made a flyer. I also had the Family Advisory Board, which gives information into the county on services and what's going well for families. So we've developed a flyer that says Families in Crisis. We've developed a flyer that says family supports and resources. And then NAMI Humboldt has a flyer, and there's a support group flyer. So get a hold of this information, because you're going to have a best friend that says, oh my God, my son is acting bizarre. What do I do? And there's a lot of resources in these flyers. So in our community, right next to home, down the street, in your neighborhood, you will have people, if they know you're even open to talking about mental illness or mental health stuff, they'll be coming to you. And if you notice, if you share a little bit of your personal experiences, it opens up a floodgate for people to talk about these issues that are still not readily talked about in our culture. And then the other thing I'm going to do, just sort of on an ending note, is to read these principles of support that we end every support group with. And if you keep these in mind, I think it will help us all become better advocates for our loved ones. So the first principle of support is we will see the individual first, not the illness. We will call someone, this is my son with bipolar disorder. This isn't a bipolar person, or this isn't a schizoid or schizophrenic. This is a person with schizophrenia. The second one is we will recognize that mental illnesses are brain disorders, much like physical disabilities. There's a reason why people, become mentally ill. We aim for better coping skills all the time, better ways to do things. We find strength in sharing experiences. I think James mentioned the value of being in a room with people that get it, people that really understand what you're going through and what your loved one could be going through. We reject stigma in ourselves and others. We still might have a little stigma left over from the past. Who knows? We will not judge anyone's pain as less than our own. Then this one's important. We forgive ourselves and reject guilt. We embrace humor as healthy. I have a lot of funny stories. I don't have time to tell them, but you need to have a little humorous outbreak sometime and laugh, sometimes even just at yourself. We accept we cannot resolve all problems. This is huge for families. We want to fix it. We want to fix it now, and we want to fix everything. And then we expect a better future in a realistic way. And the last one, which is really important, is we will never give up hope. So I want to leave these principles of support with you. They're also copied on a lot of these flyers on the NAMI table back there. But just have compassion, empathy, and understanding. And I think our community is I am so glad to be here in Humboldt County. I am so glad to be in California. I just would hate to be in some of these states, mention which ones, but that can't even tolerate a lot of things in our culture that should be part of our lives. Thanks.
I think we can get better by having empathy. I think empathy is a big one with this. When we see somebody who's homeless or mentally ill or whatever, we don't really know their story. And I think that's important, not write them off as this or that. Not judge them, basically, but to have empathy.
All right. That concludes the lived experience panel. Thank you to our panelists. It's just wonderful input all around. Let's get another round of applause.